Welcome back for our second day of the Minds in Dialogue conference. It's my pleasure to be able to start this day's program with a talk by Yitzhak Melamed titled, Is There Mind-to-Mind Causation in Spinoza?
Thank you so much, Therese. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful event. I mean, it's impeccable, and it's truly a pleasure to be here and an honor. I specifically appreciate the invitation to work on this topic because I haven't worked on Spinoza's philosophy of mind for a few years. I mean, I was doing some work in that area earlier, more actually on the metaphysics of thought. If we'll have time, I'll try to explain the difference between what I would call metaphysics of thought and philosophy of mind. But there was a problem that was lingering in my mind for a couple of years. I mean, the assumption that most Spinoza scholars have is that in Spinoza, of course, there is mind-to-mind causation. Anyone who knows anything about the parallelism in Spinoza will say that if there is body-to-body causation, then there should be a parallel mind-to-mind causation. That seems to be just as trivial as anything could be in Spinoza. If you know something about Spinoza, you know about substance monism, and the next one will know something about parallelism, something like that. Body-to-body seems to be something which is... Sorry. Body-to-body parallelism seems to be something which is completely ubiquitous in Spinoza, and the same should be also about mind-to-mind, right? However, at some point, I started seeing all kinds of passages which seem to go against it. And when you see a passage, you say, okay, that's an exception. That's a TTP passage. But God knows what are precisely Spinoza's views in the TTP. Then you see another passage, this time in an early text of Spinoza, in the Cogitata Metaphysica. You're saying, okay, that's another early text. That at some point, when these kind of exceptional cases accumulate, you're saying something must be wrong here. And that's the result is this paper. I'm not sure what is the solution, but what I'll try to do is to try to convince you, first of all, that Spinoza seems to be committed to mind-to-mind causation, or at least according to the reading that we almost all share, and that he doesn't seem to have this view, as far as I can see. So if I'm able to convince you about both of these points, this seems to be the case that some major revision is needed at the very center of our understanding of Spinoza's philosophy of mind. I have two suggestions. I think both of them are not good. I'll explain them. I mean, I'll tell you. And then I'm just, right now I'm leaving the question open. This paper is prepared for specifically, it's the first time I'm presenting this paper. It's a work in progress. I'm not saying that in order to, for you to shelter myself of questions, the other way around, just ask as much as you can, please, I mean, because I'm trying to learn to understand what is precisely going on here. So the agenda is basically, I'll begin with the case of Christ, which was originally the case in the TTP where it seems to be that the first occurrence where I happen to see where it seems that Spinoza is not allowing for mind-to-mind causation. After we see that, I'll try to go with you through the foundations of Spinoza's philosophy of mind, just to give you a little bit of the structure around it so that we'll understand what are the pressures that are basically pressing Spinoza to allow and to assert mind-to-mind causation, like telepathy or something like that. Something like that. And then we'll see some other passages which seems to be inconsistent with that. We'll discuss Spinoza's understanding of perception. And again, my understanding, if I understand it correctly, I think that this model of perception does not work so well with our understanding of mind-to-mind causation. If there were mind-to-mind causation, then the model of perception should have been, I think, slightly different. And then in the final section, I'll present my two failed attempts for a solution. Okay, so that's the agenda. Okay, so the first, the first chapter of Spinoza's Theological Political Treatise addresses the issue of prophecy. And in this context, Spinoza contrasts Christ and the Hebrew prophets. I mean, Paul is a different story. I'm not going to, I mean, it's a super interesting story, but I'm not going to address him here because Paul is not really a prophet, but he's also not Christ. And again, I'll explain it in half a second. I think that for Spinoza, Christ is, I'm not sure that he's a human being. It's actually it's the Son of God. It's the infinite intellect. It's a name, and it's not a coincidence that Spinoza almost always refers to Christ, to Christos, hardly ever to Jesus. It's always Christos, and the one place where he does refer to Jesus, he said that Christos was most instantiated in Jesus. So it seems that Christ, again, as far as I understand, I think for Spinoza, Christ is simply the infinite intellect. But we'll see that in half a second. So let's see. We clearly understand that God communicates himself immediately to man, for he communicates his essence to our mind without using any corporeal means. I think Spinoza has this view that Spinoza allows for innate ideas, and I think that he thinks that God's essence, Spinoza thinks that God's essence in some way is known to all. So we all have knowledge of God's essence, meaning of the attributes that we do know, meaning extension and thought. And then he adds, nevertheless, for a man to perceive by the mind alone things which are uncontained is the first foundation of knowledge, and can't be deduced from them, his mind would necessarily have to be more excellent and far superior to the human mind. Okay. What is it? So I do not believe that anyone else has reached such perfection, surpassing all others, except Christ, to whom the decisions of God which lead men to salvation, the decisions of God which lead men to salvation, to my mind, is just Christianity. I mean, it's just the nature of religion, were revealed immediately without words or visions. Again, pay attention, without word or visions, so it's a mind-to-mind, pure mind-to-mind causation. So God revealed himself to the apostle through Christ's mind. So Christ is becoming the kind, I mean, in a passage shortly after that, Spinoza will say, Christ is os Dei, is the mouth of God. As previously he has revealed himself to Moses by means of a heavenly voice. Okay. Now, if there are some enigmatic passages here, but the next passage is a bit even clearer, and here's it's almost there, it's about, I would say, 5 lines down the page. So here it's saying, so if Moses spoke with God face to face, as a man usually does with the companion, face to face is the words that you have in Scripture itself, panim el panim, pe el pe, by means of their two bodies. Again, pay attention, by means of two bodies. So Moses was communicating by means of two bodies. Christ indeed communicated with God mind to mind, Christos quidem de mente ad mentem cum Deo communicabit. Straight, mind to mind. We have asserted then that except for Christ, no one, pay attention, no one has received God's revelation without the aid of the imagination, namely without the aid of words or images. So Christ is the exception of mind-to-mind causation, I think. Now, Hermann Cohen, I don't know if you are familiar with that. Hermann Cohen, in 1916, gave a class at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin. The class was just a long rant against Spinoza. I mean, he was just about to, literally, that Spinoza is a traitor, and how dare he to say all of the things. And one of the things that, of course, he accused him is just, how dare he to say that Christ is better than Moses. Well, again, Spinoza does not necessarily belong to the jingoism of Cohen, and it's perfectly legitimate for Spinoza to say, give me a break. I don't care about what you're saying. This being said, I think that Cohen also didn't understand what Spinoza was saying there. I think that what Spinoza was saying there was actually, he was reading Christ not as a human being. It was just a name for the infinite intellect, the immediate infinite mode of the attribute of thought. So the story is a bit more complex. I mean, Spinoza is trying to accommodate his Christian readers. I think he has definitely some sympathy for Christianity, especially in terms of what he takes to be its universalism. But Christian readers who read Spinoza, read the TTP, and thought that, and saw his playing with some basic tenets of Christianity, immediately felt that something here is fishy, and all hell breaks out in the very last 2 years of Spinoza when he's corresponding with Oldenburg, and there he basically opens his view and he's saying, "Oh, I believe in the birth and the crucifixion of Christ literally, but resurrection is an allegory, right?" And that's, he thinks that it's not a problem. Of course, I mean, saying that the revival of Christ is an allegory is not particularly something that Oldenburg is happy with. So the story does not end so well, to be honest. But again, this is a side story. I mean, it's a super interesting side story. But there is a side story of the side story where Spinoza is basically ascribing to Paul. Paul is Spinoza's favorite biblical figure, I think, by far. But he's actually, there is a trade here. Spinoza is actually converting Paul to Spinozism. And the way he's doing that, he is basically ascribing, time and again, he is ascribing Spinozistic views to Paul. Okay? The culmination of this process happens in this very late correspondence with Oldenburg, where he claims that only he and Paul understood the resurrection secundum spiritum, according to the spirit, meaning not meaning allegorically, while all others understood the resurrection only secundum carnem. So there is a very deep, it's a kind of a very radical view. Again, it's an interesting side story. I'll put it aside. I'd be happy to, if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer that. Let's go back to our topic. So anyway, for our purposes, what is most striking is Spinoza's claim that only Christ communicates with God de mente ad mentem. On the face of it, not case of it, we would think that for Spinoza, all minds communicate mind to mind without using any corporeal means, right? Why so? So again, I'll point out two elements in Spinoza. So first of all, thinks about the idea, thinks parallelism, proposition 7 of part 2, the order connection of ideas is the same in order connection of things. Whatever follows formally from God's infinite nature follows objectively in God from his idea in the same order and the same connection. So there is any kind, so if I interact right now with if my finger interacts with the microphone, the idea of the finger should interact with the idea of the microphone. Okay? That's, if there is causal relation between two bodies, there must be parallel causal relation between two ideas. Moreover, Spinoza is also committed to what we call the barrier between the attributes. So the barrier is erected actually in part 1 of the ethics, in proposition 10, where he's saying that each attribute is conceived through itself, but in proposition 6, he is making the further step, saying it's not only that there is no cross-conceivability between one attribute and another, so there is no explanation that are running from one attribute to another, but there are also no causal relations. So proposition 6 of part 2 basically asserts that all causation and all explanations must run internally to each attribute. the mind cannot be explained by the body cannot be explained by the mind. They run parallel to each other. Okay? So when you combine these two things, it seems that, you know, mind-to-mind causation should be everywhere. Mind-to-mind causation should be the most trivial thing that you see. I mean, I'll mention that in half a second, but Spinoza is also committed and to the claim that everything is animated. So it's not only that there is an idea in God of the microphone, to some degree, is animated. It has a mind, a tiny mind, an idiotic mind, extremely, extremely, extremely unsophisticated mind, but that's the mind of the microphone. Okay? And so when my body communicates with the microphone, my mind communicates with the mind of the microphone. Okay? That's, I think, roughly the idea. Now, the fact that we do not see mind-to-mind communication in the world, you and I and all of us, I do not count it as in itself an evidence against this view of Spinoza. Why? Because there are many crazy things in Spinoza. So if we're just another one to the list of crazy claims of Spinoza, fine. I mean, we know that Spinoza has all kinds of bold claims. Some of them seem to be far-fetched. For example, that the microphone has a mind. Actually, I think it's an interesting view, but I can explain why I think it's an interesting view. So Spinoza is a panpsychist, literally. Spinoza is clearly a panpsychist. All this being said, I think that even when you look at Spinoza's own claims, there is something that is not working about mind-to-mind causation. It's not only the fact that we think that mind-to-mind causation does not obtain in the world, but there is something really that does not click here in terms of the text of Spinoza. So let's see. So you see one evidence for that, right? The claim that Christ communicated with, Christ was the exceptional case of mind-to-mind communication, right? Again, on the face of it, given Spinoza's commitment to propositions 6 and 7 of part 2, mind-to-mind communication should be everywhere. It should be just as common as body-to-body communication. Okay, let's move ahead. So that's another statement. Okay, it's a little bit more. So E2P9 is, again, a statement of the parallelism, idea things parallelism, but this time it's speaking about how singular things, whether they are bodies actually or anything else, are communicating, are causally communicating. And the claim is that in the same way, the ideas of singular things are communicating one with the other, right? In proposition 11, Spinoza is saying that the mind is nothing but an idea of a singular thing. Singular things is a finite thing, let's put it roughly. I mean, singular thing is a finite thing. So what is to be a mind is just to be an idea of a singular thing. So if E2P9 is saying that there is causal relationship between ideas of singular things, E2P11 seems to say that, well, ideas of singular things are a mind. Therefore, ergo, the immediate implication is mind-to-mind causation is there all the time. That's what we see, right? Something like that. Okay. Just if you want some quick entertainment, so consider the case of Balaam and his donkey, his she-donkey. Right? So the prophet, Balaam the prophet and his she-donkey, Balaam rides his donkey, hence there are causal relation between their bodies. Therefore, per E2P7, there must be direct causal relation between the ideas representing their bodies, meaning the idea of Balaam mind and the donkey's mind. However, we are hardly ever aware of such mind-to-mind causal relations. So the fact that we are hardly aware is indeed a fact. I think most of us do not believe in telepathy or think that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not asking everyone here what precisely are their views, but at least my experience with telepathy was not very good. Apart from yesterday when I had a conversation with Suf and asked her to give me a number, and it turned out that we had the same number, but it was working only for one case.
Well, half the times we tried.
Yeah, we tried twice. So that's true. That's absolutely true. Anyway, But what bothers me more than the fact that most people think that mind-to-mind causation is craziness, is the fact that Spinoza himself seems to suggest that hardly ever, with the exception of Christ, does it occur. So what is happening here precisely, right? What is, and in order to understand that, I mean, again, I want to broaden a little bit the context just to give you a little bit more of the foundations of Spinoza's philosophy of mind so that we'll be able to understand the constraints on the formulation and attempts to answer the question. So I'll do it very, very quickly. One key axiom appears at the beginning of part one of the ethics. That's the claim is cognition of an effect depends on involves cognition of its cause. Curly translated as knowledge. That's, I think, a mistranslation is cognitio. For Spinoza, cognitio can be inadequate. So since most of us assume that knowledge is factive, I think that knowledge is a problem. So that's why I stick to the perhaps less eloquent cognition, but I think that that's a more precise translation. So anyway, cognition of fact depends on involved cognition of its cause, meaning that whenever you understand something, in some way, you also understand its causes, or at least the understanding of the causes, understanding the cause is a cognition for proper understanding of a thing. Again, the precise meaning of this axiom is open to debate. It might also be part of the question that we will need to address, but it is a central claim of Spinoza. There is a fair question about whether the bridge between ideas, between cognition and conception, cognition and causation is a two-way bridge, meaning does it imply if there is cognition, there is causation, and if there is causation, there is cognition one through the other. I think it is a two-way bridge. Again, some interpreters are trying to argue that it's not, it's just one-way bridge, just going in one direction. Again, for our purposes, it's not that important. Spinoza is also committed to the very traditional view of divine omniscience. So he states that in proposition 3 of part 2, God has knowledge of the essence of everything which follows from the essence of God, which means everything. So divine omniscience, there is no point of. And Spinoza is also committed to panpsychism. So again, the passage appears in one passage. There are more in the Colloquium to proposition 12. The things we have shown so far, he's discussing certain things about the human mind and saying, are completely general and do not pertain more to men than to other individuals, all of which, though in different degrees, are nevertheless animate. For each thing there is necessary an idea in God, of which God is the cause in the same way as he is the idea of the human body. And so whatever we've said of the idea of the human body must also be said of the idea of anything. Some people are trying to provide charitable interpretation, saying, no, it didn't mean that. I'm a Spinoza Stalinist. I mean, I think that whenever he's saying what he means what he's saying. And I think that he is committed to panpsychism. I think that's a view. Okay. Then there is a little bit more complex story, and that's the claim that the human mind is part of God's infinite intellect. There are many problems with this claim, and I'm not sure we have a good understanding of what precisely is going on there. And I think that at least my hunch is that understanding the medieval background might be really helpful here, because I want to understand what precisely Spinoza has in mind. But here's the claim. It's the corollary to proposition 11 of part 2. From this it follows that the human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God. Therefore, when it said that the human mind perceived this or that, we're saying nothing but that God, not insofar as God is infinite, but insofar as he is explained. Explained is not necessarily the best translation. I think that explicated might be better, because it's not going backwards. I think the Latin explicare can also mean spelling out. So again, I generally, Curly is a good translator. I mean, with the explained here, I'm not sure. I think that explicare a lot of times is simply a little bit misleading. So anyway, insofar as he explicated through the nature of the human mind, or insofar as he constitutes the essence of the human mind, has this or that idea. So, so when we say that, I mean, for Spinoza to say that I have a certain idea and to say that God has a certain idea, there is a sense in which it's the same claim. So it's, when I'm saying that I have an idea, it's just God insofar as he spell out as constituting the human mind. It's a way for God to have the same idea, right? Roughly. Then immediately, the next sentence is also telling us what happens when the same idea, let's suppose it's the idea of a certain elephant, right? So what happens if the idea of that elephant appears both in my mind but also in the mind of someone else? I don't know, in the mind of Balaam. Okay, so let's see what, so here's and we say that God has this or that idea, not only insofar as it constitutes the nature of the human mind, but insofar he also has the idea of another thing together with the human mind. Then we say that the human mind perceives thing only partially or inadequately. So again, there will be a debate about what precisely the meaning of that, but it seems that if God's knowledge of the elephant is both through my mind and through Balaam's mind, then my mind is having only a partial story of the thing. Why? Because there is something else. There is another part of this idea, of God's idea of the elephant, which is actually not in my mind, it's only in Balaam's mind. And therefore, my knowledge of the elephant is inadequate, because the part which is, the part of the idea of the elephant, which is just in Balaam's mind, is not mine. I can extend, I mean, you know, there might be ways for me to extend my idea of the elephant, but that's roughly, I think, at least one account, the major account of inadequacy of ideas in Spinoza. Okay. Now, let me show you another passage in Spinoza's early works, where a passage which again seems to work very poorly with the claim that mind-to-mind causation obtains in Spinoza. So let me have a look at that together. So the passage appears in the Cogitata Metaphysica. It's an appendix to Spinoza's 1663 book on Descartes' Principles of Philosophy. What is precisely the nature of these texts is open to debate. Some of the claims they're represent the views of the early Spinoza. Some of them represent the views of Descartes. Some of them represent perhaps other views, perhaps. Some commentators are saying ban this text. I think it's wrong, because there are super interesting claims there that are happening, and some of the most interesting metaphysical claims, for example, Spinoza's understanding of time and eternity, are discussed in this text in a much more elaborate manner than in any of the other texts. So I don't want to give it away. I mean, I think it's important to try to understand, and then what you need to do is just to work carefully in order to see whether the view here is a Cartesian view or to what extent it is representing Spinoza. So the passage at stake is presented under the following title: How God's preservation is related to his determination of things to act. So, and the question is basically how God's concurrence is related to causation of final things. Okay, that's the context of the discussion. And here's what Spinoza is saying. For us, really, the crucial point is just the last two lines, but saying, still, in order not to mention this question uselessly, we shall reply in passing to the query whether it adds something to God's preservation when he determines a thing to act, usually a final thing. When we spoke of motion, we already suggested an answer to this, for we said that God preserved the same quantity of motion in nature. So if we attend to the whole nature of matter, nothing new is added to it. But with respect to particular things, again, still we're still at the level of extended or bodies. If we, with respect to particular physical things, it can, in a sense, be said that something new is added to them when God is preserving an action. here comes the following sentence saying, it does not seem that this applies to spiritual things. Why? For it is not evident, pay attention to the formulation, it is not evident that they depend on one another in this way. Again, I can bring you would rightly ask, let's see the wider context. The wider context does not solve that, but you're very much invited to try to understand it. But on the face of it, it seems to say Spinoza is not sure. It's not evident whether minds interact with each other in the same way that bodies interact with each other. It's not evident. He's hesitating, something like that. Okay, I have another 10, 12 minutes, yes. Okay, good. So here comes the model of perception. I'll summarize that. So for Spinoza, what happens when my mind perceives a body is the following. My mind for Spinoza has ideas only of one thing, truly. It is just ideas of my body. It's an interesting view. So how do I have an idea, for example, of this wall? Well, the idea I have of the wall is really an idea of a nexus, of the interaction of the wall with my body. To the extent that the ball is impinging or having some sort of affecting my body, my mind is basically having just ideas of the nexus between my body and external interaction. And therefore, the idea I have usually is a kind of a mixed and unclear idea, because it is bringing together the external input and the nature of my body together, and usually does not distinguish them. So that's why perceptions for Spinoza in itself is confused, because it is coming from two sources and it does not make the distinction between what is coming from the nature. So I don't have, in perception, I don't have a good understanding of the nature of the external body, because there is also some input coming from the nature of my body that is shaping this concept. But I also don't have a good understanding of my body itself, because the perceptions that I have of my body itself are also all the time. And my body is always a nexus of causation from external sources. So whenever I have, whatever kind of perceptions I have of external bodies or of my own body, they will always be, or at least at the first stage, they will be confused, because they are mixing these kind of two sources together. Okay. And that's the way for Spinoza, again, that's the way by which I have an idea of an external body. Okay? For example, the idea of this blue wall. Now, so here's the statement by my dear former teacher, just explaining that and saying, here Spinoza is saying that the idea parallel to a bodily mode E, in a case in which E is caused by a body external to the human body, involves the nature of the external body. Spinoza next says that from his claim that the idea of parallel to the bodily mode involves body mode E involves the nature of the external, but that is the cause of E. It follows that the human body perceives that external cause. All this is fine. I think that's the standard view, and I think that it's actually, I think that's what Spinoza is saying. I mean, the problem which bothers me is the following. Pay attention. I mean, my body interacted just a minute ago, and still interacting with this wall, right? As I told you, for Spinoza, the wall has an idea, and since having a mind is nothing but having an idea, so the wall has a mind, right? The mind of that blue wall. Now, the wall caused some changes in my body, specifically in my eye, but there was, so it seems that at the same level, right, the mind of the wall, the idea of the wall, interacted at the same time also with my mind. Now, Spinoza even further claims that we have an idea of an idea. I have so I have some self-knowledge of the mind. Right? So it seems, because in the same way that ideas things parallel, ideas themselves are things, therefore there is a parallelism between ideas of first level, second level, third level, going up to infinity. You can have, if you can have higher order ideas as far as you wish. Okay. Now comes the question, wait, this mind affected my mind. So there is some sort of a nexus in my mind, which is just the interaction of the external, the mind of the wall on the nature of my mind. There is also an idea of that, right? There is a second order idea of that. But I know nothing about that. Now, the worst thing is that Spinoza says nothing about that. He's absolutely silent about that. He's not saying a word about how the other mind is actually interacting with me. And I'm saying, why? What precisely is happening here? One slightly different way to make the same point, or it's closely related point, is that for Spinoza, the extended realm is a plenum with no islands isolated from the race of extension. And the question whether it's the same thing can be said about the mind. Is the mind a plenum, right, with no boundaries? I mean, again, the view that Spinoza would like, it seems to be saying, is in the same way that our bodies are not isolated one to the other. Our mind should not be isolated from one to the other. Now, again, that's not the experience most of us have. But the question whether Spinoza is really committed to this claim, and I'm not sure, because you would expect him to say, that's a real innovation to claim that, you know, there is no boundaries of the ego. There is no boundaries between one mind and another. And you would expect him to say that if it's a strong claim. You expect him to elaborate that. And he's just passing over all of that in silence. And again, in two places, I think there are a bit more, but in two places we've seen, he's either saying there is no mind-to-mind causation apart from in the case of Christ, or he's saying minds do not seem to have this kind of connection between each other, this kind of internal connection one with the other. So what precisely is going on here? Right? There is a very strong reason for Spinoza to have the notion of mind-to-mind causation. But again, it is implied, it is not made clear, it is not developed in any way, and it's a huge thing. If it were indeed Spinoza's view, why should he be silent about it? So here are one attempted solution. So one way to think about it is to say, wait a minute, perhaps we should make a distinction between two realms of the mind. One is the purely intellectual realm in which we are speaking just about ideas in God's intellect without the imagination. And this mind, I think there is a sense in which this intellect, it's not mind, because for Spinoza, mind always connotes some sort of finitude and association with imagination. For Spinoza, mind always involves the imagination, I think. But in this infinite intellect, there is some sense of a plenum, or if you wish, of holism. I mean, everything is connected to everything. It's a perfect map. It's a perfect conceptual map of the world. And in such a world, you'll say, yes, there is some sort of, you can say causal relations, but it's causation not in time. I'm not bothered by that. Spinoza allows for causation not in time. Spinoza is not alone, actually, in the 17th century. I think most 17th century philosophers allow for efficient causation that is not in time. Moreover, Spinoza expands the notion of efficient causation very significantly to the way I read Spinoza. I think that for Spinoza, all causation is just efficient causation, and all the functions of the other causes are incorporated in different ways into the functions of the efficient cause, including teleology, including formal causation, including everything. So that's, but all this being said, you said, so perhaps we can explain this kind of mind-to-mind causation simply as a conceptual relation between ideas in God's intellect, and this conceptual map in God's intellect is supposed to be in some way holistic, and if you wish, you can call it a plenum. I mean, again, plenum usually requires space, right? I mean, so assuming we're using this kind of as a metaphor, fine. You can speak about something like a mental plenum or conceptual plenum or something like that. It doesn't work. Why? Because Spinoza applies the same E to P7, the order connection of ideas is the order connection of things, also to propositions dealing with the imagination, where the issue is not only just ideas in God's intellect, but ideas in the finite mind, right? And so he's applying that to, and it's not even one case. Sometimes you're saying, okay, there is one case, perhaps an exception, perhaps Spinoza, human being may make errors, etc. At least 3 cases, I think there are more. I mean, after I saw 3 places where he's using the idea of things parallelism to discuss the imagination, I think I don't need to work more. It's not an error. There is something, I think, he thinks that the idea of things parallelism works also at the level of the imagination. So this option does not work. So let's try to, at least a slightly different way. So let's think about perhaps, again, let's go to our favorite example. I'm going to finish with that. So our favorite example is Balaam's mind causing the mind of the donkey, and vice versa. Both of them have minds, etc. But she's not aware of this causal influence, and then perhaps one answer you would say, perhaps if Balaam's mind is the cause of the donkey's mind, the donkey should know. So, I'm sorry. So the question is, why I'm not aware of that? Why Balaam is not aware of this mental causation that is coming from the donkey, and of course the other way around. Neither one of them is aware of, I mean, we are aware of the bodily causation, right? But we are not aware of the mental causation. And one response will be saying, you have this causation, just you're not aware of that. Spinoza is not committed to the claim that we know everything that is happening in our body. There's a whole discussion about that, but he doesn't seem to add this view eventually, that we know everything that is truly happening in our body. The problem is that it seems that if there were such causation between the mind of Balaam and the mind of the donkey, right? You would expect to have these ideas and to be at least to some degree conscious of it. Why? Because you have second-order ideas. Balaam has second-order ideas. The donkey has second-order ideas. Again, if you wish to go with the Spinoza craziness, for Spinoza, it's not only that the microphone has ideas and a mind, the microphone is also to an infinitesimal degree self-conscious. It has idea of an idea. So again, to the basic infinitesimal degree, the mind is also going to be self-conscious in the same way that it is in infinitesimal degree aware, or it is having a mind, right? So that's one thing, but the other point is that why is Spinoza never trying to develop his account of perception just at the level of the mind, at the level of the mind-to-mind causation, and the fact that I'm having ideas of ideas, and I should have an idea of the nexus by which the wall is impacting, the mind of the wall, I'm sorry, should be careful. The mind of the wall is impacting my mind. So I don't think that either solution work. What we are left with is a problem. Again, if I'm right, there is something that either Spinoza was not aware of, I don't know, or there is something pretty basic that we misunderstand about precisely his philosophy of mind and about his understanding of the parallelism doctrine. I'll stop here.